He helps a woman with a flat tire, just like he's done many times before, but this time, the next morning, a black SUV shows up at his door. What happens next will change his life forever. John had always been the kind of person who did his best to keep to himself. At 42, he was a simple man with a simple life. He lived in a small, modest home on the outskirts of the city, working long hours as a mechanic at a nearby auto shop. The work was hard, but it paid the bills, and that was all he really needed. His house was small but comfortable enough, filled with little reminders of the past, a few old photographs, a few relics from better days. But John's life hadn't always been this way. As a child, he never knew his father. His mother, struggling to raise him on her own, had to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. As a result, John spent most of his childhood alone, often fending for himself while his mother worked late into the night. The loneliness shaped him into someone who kept his distance from others, always afraid of being let down or hurt. His teenage years weren't much better. John had trouble fitting in, often finding solace in a few bad habits. He had gotten involved in a rough crowd and made decisions he regretted. His early adulthood was defined by a series of mistakes, culminating in a brief but painful marriage that ended in divorce. When it was over, he was left with nothing, no wife, no kids, and no family around to turn to. Life had taught John one thing: people would always let you down. And so, he built walls around himself. He kept his circle small, mostly his work and the few acquaintances he had. But he wasn't unhappy. No, John had come to accept the solitude that had followed him for so many years. It was better this way. Or so he thought. But on this particular rainy evening, something was about to happen that would change everything. It was a typical rainy night, the kind of night where the rain seemed to come in sheets, blurring everything beyond the headlights of John's old pickup truck. He was on his way home after another long shift at the auto shop, tired and eager to collapse into bed. The radio played a low hum, a background noise that didn't quite reach his tired mind. The wet pavement made the streets shine, and the world outside felt distant, as though the rain had created a barrier between him and everything else. As John passed the familiar stretch of road that led to his neighborhood, he noticed something: a figure standing beside a car, struggling with the jack of a flat tire. The car's hazards blinked weakly in the rain, a sign of distress. At first, John considered driving past. It was late, and he just wanted to get home. But something made him hesitate. The woman appeared frustrated, and even from a distance, John could see her struggle with the car's jack, her movements quick but desperate. He glanced around. There was no one else in sight. It was just her, stranded in the rain. With a sigh, John made a sharp turn and pulled over behind her. He killed the engine, stepped out of his truck, and braced himself against the heavy downpour as he approached. "Looks like you've got a flat," John said, trying to sound casual, though his voice was barely audible over the rain's relentless tapping. The woman looked up at him, her expression a mixture of relief and hesitation. "Yeah, it's stuck. I can't get the damn jack to work," she replied, frustration evident in her voice. John took a step closer, feeling an odd sense of responsibility despite not knowing this woman. "Let me help you with that," he said, his hands already reaching for the tools in the back of his truck. The woman hesitated at first, looking at him as if trying to read his intentions. She was alone on a dark, rainy night. Most people wouldn't stop for a stranger. But then, after a moment of doubt, she nodded, her trust shifting in his direction. John got to work quickly, his hands skilled from years of fixing cars. As he worked, he started a conversation with her, asking about her day. She told him she had been out with some friends, returning home late when she realized the tire was flat. It wasn't an unusual story, but as they talked, John learned a bit about her life, how she had just started a new job, how she had moved to the area only a few months ago, and how she was still getting used to the long, lonely drives. John shared bits about himself too, though he didn't say much. He spoke briefly about his work at the shop and the quiet life he led. There was something about talking to this woman, someone who wasn't Mr. Freeman, his only close friend, that made him feel oddly light. For once, it felt like someone saw him for more than just the man who fixed cars. Within minutes, the tire was replaced, and John stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag. The woman stood up, her face softening as she looked at him. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice sincere. "I didn't know what I was going to do out here in the rain." John smiled and nodded, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. "No problem," he said simply. "Take care of yourself." She climbed into her car, but before she closed the door, she looked at him again. "You're a good man," she said, her words lingering in the air. John watched her drive off into the rain, her brake lights fading into the distance. He stood there for a moment, the cold rain soaking through his jacket. For a brief moment, he wondered if it was worth it, helping a stranger on a night like this. But as he turned back to his truck and climbed inside, something told him it had been. It was a small thing, really, but in that moment, John felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a connection to another human being. The rain hadn't stopped by the time John made it home. He parked his truck in the driveway and sat there for a moment, watching the droplets run down the windshield. It had been a long day, but there was a strange sense of peace in helping someone, even in the pouring rain. As he sat in his truck, John felt a small part of him feel lighter, as though the weight of his solitary life had momentarily lifted. He grabbed his keys and stepped out into the rain, making a quick dash for the front door. When he got inside, he immediately hung up his jacket and went to the kitchen, where he made himself a simple dinner. It wasn't much, a few slices of bread, some cheese, and a glass of water, but it felt like enough. As John ate, his mind kept drifting back to the woman he'd helped. There was something about her that lingered in his thoughts, the way she had smiled when he finished changing her tire, the gratitude in her voice. He realized he hadn't even gotten her name. That was just the kind of man John was, though. He helped out of pure kindness, without expecting anything in return. Later that night, after cleaning up and watching a bit of television, John went to bed, still thinking about the woman. He fell asleep quickly, exhausted, his mind finally quieting. But the next morning, everything changed. John was still groggy when he heard the knock at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, at least not this early. He rubbed his eyes, wondering if maybe it was one of his neighbors. He was still in his pajamas when he walked to the door and opened it. Standing on his porch was a man in an expensive-looking suit, flanked by two other men who looked like they belonged to the same world of wealth. They stood by a sleek black SUV parked in front of his driveway. John blinked, momentarily unsure if he was still half asleep. The man in the suit smiled and stepped forward. "You must be John, right?" he asked in a calm, measured voice. "Yeah, that's me," John replied, still trying to process the sight before him. "Can I help you?" The man introduced himself as Gerald, and without missing a beat, he pulled out his phone and showed John a picture of the woman from last night. "This is my sister, Sarah," Gerald explained. "She's the one you helped change her tire last night. She couldn't stop talking about you, about your kindness. In fact, she insisted I come by and thank you properly." John felt a wave of confusion. Sarah? He didn't even know her last name. He was just being a good Samaritan, helping someone in need. But Gerald's tone was sincere, and the way he spoke about his sister made John feel like he had somehow been a part of something much bigger. "I didn't really do anything," John said awkwardly, trying to downplay his small act of kindness. "I was just helping her out. It's no big deal." But Gerald, with a small smile, shook his head. "Sarah insists. She told me to bring this," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a white envelope. "She wants you to have it." John froze for a moment, staring at the envelope. His gut told him something was off. This wasn't just about thanking him for helping her change a tire. The whole situation felt too formal, too staged. It didn't make sense. Gerald handed the envelope to John, but John didn't take it. He stood there, unsure of what to do, feeling an odd mixture of guilt and confusion. All he had done was help someone in need on a rainy night. Why was it suddenly turning into something much more complicated? The two men stood there, waiting for him to take it. John's mind raced, wondering who these people really were and why they were standing on his doorstep. What had he gotten himself into? But something in the back of his mind urged him to open the envelope, to see what was inside. Gerald seemed patient, but insistent. "Please, John, it's really important to her that you accept this. She's been worried about you all night, ever since you helped her." John hesitated, feeling a lump form in his throat. The small, quiet life he had worked so hard to maintain was suddenly being upended by this unexpected visit. He wondered just how much more his life would change now that Sarah and her family were involved. Would his simple kindness turn into something he couldn't control? With a deep breath, John took the envelope, still unsure of what would come next. But one thing was clear. His life was about to change forever, in ways he could never have imagined. John stood at his front door, the white envelope in his hands feeling heavier than it should. The rain had stopped, but a thick silence hung in the air, adding to the weight of the moment. He looked down at the envelope, his mind racing as he wondered what exactly he was holding. What could Sarah, the woman he helped last night, want to give him? And why had her brother come all the way to his house to deliver it? Gerald stood patiently, watching him. The two other men in suits remained behind, standing near the black SUV with arms folded, their presence unnerving. John felt uncomfortable, like a small-town mechanic suddenly thrust into the world of high society. He wasn't used to this, and part of him wanted to close the door, walk away, and pretend none of this had happened. But the way Gerald spoke, so kindly, yet with a sense of urgency, stopped him from doing that. The mention of Sarah's gratitude, her insistence on thanking him properly, tugged at something deep inside John. For years, he had lived in quiet isolation, helping others when he could, but never expecting anything in return. The fact that someone was willing to go out of their way to thank him in such a grand manner felt overwhelming. John's fingers trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside, there was a check, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the amount, more money than he had ever seen in his life. It was more than enough to take care of his mortgage, pay off his debts, and live comfortably for months, perhaps even longer. John's first instinct was to push the check back into the envelope and refuse it. This wasn't why he had helped Sarah. He didn't need or want money. The simple act of helping her was enough. But Gerald's calm voice broke through John's thoughts. "Sarah insists. She's been through a lot, and she wants you to have it. She's deeply grateful for your kindness." John looked up at Gerald, still holding the check. I don't know if I can accept this," John stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just changed a tire. It's not a big deal." Gerald's smile softened, and there was an understanding in his eyes, as if he had anticipated John's reaction. "It's not just about the tire, John. It's about what you did for her. You were there when no one else was. You gave her something that most people wouldn't have. Sarah knows how rare that is, and she wants to show her appreciation in a way that feels right." John felt a lump form in his throat. His mind swirled with doubt. He had lived most of his life believing that people only took from him his time, his kindness, his energy, without ever giving anything back. He didn't know how to handle this sudden generosity. The weight of the check felt like an anchor, pulling him deeper into unfamiliar waters. But then, something shifted. He thought back to the moment when he helped Sarah on the side of the road. He had done it because it felt right, because he couldn't bear to leave her stranded in the rain. He hadn't expected anything in return, and yet here he was, faced with an opportunity he never would have imagined. The kindness he had given had come back to him in a way he couldn't have foreseen. John took a deep breath and looked back at Gerald. I don't know what to say," he finally muttered. The lump in his throat didn't go away, but it was no longer just uncertainty. There was something else there too, something close to hope. Gerald nodded, as if he understood the internal struggle John was going through. "You don't have to say anything, John. Just know that Sarah sees you. We all see you. And she's not the only one who's grateful." John swallowed hard, his eyes welling up. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to be seen, to be acknowledged. He had lived so long in the shadows of his own life, quietly helping others without ever asking for anything. And now, in this strange moment, someone was acknowledging him, his efforts, his kindness, his humanity. It was more than he had ever hoped for. With a shaking hand, John accepted the check, though it still felt surreal. "Tell Sarah thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Please, tell her I'm grateful for this, more than she knows." Gerald's smile widened, and he placed a hand on John's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and understanding. "She'll be happy to hear that. Don't worry, John, this is just the beginning." John nodded, though his mind was still in a fog. He stood there, staring at the check in his hand, feeling both overwhelmed and deeply moved. It was as if his simple act of kindness had opened the door to a new chapter in his life, one filled with possibilities he had never dreamed of. As Gerald and the other men turned to leave, John closed the door behind him, still holding the check. He leaned against it, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't in a long while: hope. The next few days were a blur for John. The weight of the check in his wallet felt both comforting and burdensome. It was more than just money. It was a sign that things could be different, that he could have a chance to change his life in a way he never thought possible. But as the days passed, he began to wrestle with himself. The money felt like a reward he didn't deserve. He kept telling himself that he had only helped a woman change a tire, and yet here he was, holding something that seemed far too generous for such a simple act. John tried to go about his usual routine, but his mind kept drifting back to Sarah and Gerald. The way they had spoken about him, the respect in their voices, it made him uneasy. In his world, people didn't treat others like that. People didn't offer money or opportunities just because of a kind gesture. There had to be a catch, right? But as each day passed and he held on to the check, it became harder for him to ignore the idea that perhaps, just maybe, he could take this chance. One afternoon, John sat down with Mr. Freeman, his longtime neighbor and the closest thing he had to a friend. Mr. Freeman had been there for him during his darkest days, offering advice, support, and the kind of quiet encouragement that only a real friend could provide. Over cups of coffee, John explained the situation, how he'd helped a woman in the rain, and how that had led to this unexpected gift. "You're thinking too much about it," Mr. Freeman said, leaning back in his chair with a knowing smile. "You've always been the kind of man who helped others without expecting anything. Why not accept what's given to you now?" John hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "It just feels wrong. It's too much, too sudden. I didn't do anything special. I don't know why they're treating me like I'm some kind of hero." "You didn't have to be a hero, John. You just had to be human. Sometimes, when you put good into the world, it comes back to you. But it's up to you whether you're going to accept that or keep running from it." John's chest tightened as he listened. The truth was, he had always been afraid of accepting help, of accepting kindness. His whole life had been about doing things on his own, never relying on anyone. He had shut people out, pushed them away, convinced himself that he didn't deserve their affection or their support. But now, with Sarah's family offering him more than he could have imagined, he was faced with a choice: continue living in the shadows or step into the light and embrace what was being offered. The decision didn't come easily, but something inside him shifted. The next morning, John took the check and walked into the bank, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. As he deposited the money into his account, he realized that he was not just accepting a financial gift, he was accepting the possibility of a different life, one where he didn't have to be alone or disconnected. But that wasn't all. Just a few days after the bank visit, John received another call from Gerald. This time, Gerald's voice was filled with enthusiasm. "John, I have some exciting news for you. I spoke to the team at the Golden Leaf Company, and they're offering you an opportunity to come in for an interview. There's a position opening up, and they're very interested in you." John couldn't believe it. The Golden Leaf Company was the kind of place he had dreamed of working at for years, a prestigious company that seemed out of reach for someone like him. But now, with the opportunity presented to him, John's life was starting to take a turn he never could have predicted. The interview was scheduled, and as the days passed, John prepared himself. He knew this was his chance, not just to prove his worth, but to show that he could rise above his past, to become the person he had always wanted to be. For the first time in years, he felt alive with possibility. The day of the interview arrived, and John put on the best clothes he had, which weren't much, but they were enough. As he walked into the Golden Leaf Company building, he felt like an imposter. The sleek offices, the polished floors, the well-dressed employees, it all felt like a world he didn't belong to. But he held his head high and walked into the interview with a steady determination, ready to face whatever came next. The interview went better than he could have hoped. The hiring manager, a sharp woman named Emily, seemed impressed by John's hands-on experience and his work ethic. They discussed his life, his time as a mechanic, his struggles, and how he had come out on the other side. He told her about his time working with Mr. Freeman and how that had helped him turn his life around. By the end of the interview, Emily offered him the job. "We're impressed with you, John," she said with a smile. "You've got the experience we're looking for, and more importantly, you've got the heart." When John walked out of the building, he couldn't help but smile. He had done it. He had taken the leap, embraced the opportunity, and it had paid off. His life was changing in ways he never imagined, and it all started with one rainy night, one flat tire, and a simple act of kindness. As he made his way back home, John felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. His life wasn't perfect, but it was better. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a place in the world. It wasn't just about the job or the money, it was about the transformation that had taken place within him. He had learned to accept help, to let others in, and to trust that good things could come from unexpected places. John knew that the road ahead would still have challenges, but he also knew that he was no longer alone. He had a new chapter ahead of him, one where kindness, hope, and second chances would guide him through the unknown. John's life had changed, and as the days turned into weeks, he began to realize that the universe had a way of returning what you gave. The small acts of kindness that seemed inconsequential at the time were the seeds of something much greater. It wasn't just about fixing a flat tire in the rain, it was about the ripple effect that kindness can create. By helping Sarah on a lonely, rainy night, John had unknowingly opened the door to a future he had never thought possible. The lesson was simple, but profound. Kindness, even when it seems small, has the power to change lives. John's hesitation to accept the gift from Sarah and her family was understandable. He had lived most of his life thinking he wasn't worthy of such generosity. He had pushed people away, lived in the shadows, and convinced himself that he was better off alone. But in accepting the kindness that was offered to him, John had unlocked a door to his own redemption. It wasn't just the financial gift or the job at the Golden Leaf Company that had changed him. It was the realization that he wasn't invisible, that his kindness had been noticed. The small, simple things we do for others, helping someone in need, offering a listening ear, or extending a hand, don't always go unnoticed. And sometimes, when you least expect it, that kindness comes back to you in ways that you couldn't have imagined. For John, the change was more than external. Yes, the money and the job were life-changing, but the most significant transformation was internal. He had learned to trust again, to accept the love and kindness of others, and to embrace the opportunities that came his way. John had spent so many years hiding from the world, afraid of getting hurt or rejected. But now, he saw that the world wasn't as cold and unforgiving as he had believed. People were willing to help, to connect, and to offer a second chance, even when it seemed like they had no reason to. As John settled into his new job at Golden Leaf, he took a moment to reflect on everything that had led him here. He thought back to the rainy night when he helped Sarah, to the moment he accepted the check, to the interview where he almost couldn't believe it was real. It had all been so unexpected, but in the end, it had taught him a powerful lesson about the strength of human connection and the unexpected rewards of doing good in the world. He thought of Mr. Freeman, his old neighbor, who had always believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. Mr. Freeman had been right all along. Kindness, no matter how small, was never wasted. It had a way of returning, sometimes when you needed it the most. John didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't the same man who had walked alone in the rain that night. He had changed, and the world around him had changed too. Life had shown him that even in the darkest of times, there was always room for kindness, and that kindness could light the way to something better. With each passing day, John's confidence grew. He felt more connected to those around him, more open to the possibilities that life had to offer. He no longer feared reaching out, whether it was to help someone in need or to accept the help that came his way. The walls he had spent years building had started to come down, and for the first time in his life, John felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The message was clear. When you put kindness into the world, it doesn't just benefit others, it benefits you too. You never know how a simple act can change the course of your life, but one thing was certain. Kindness has a way of finding its way back to you, often in ways that are more extraordinary than you could ever expect. And sometimes, the best way to receive that kindness is to open yourself up to it and trust that the world will reward you for the good you've put into it. For John, the future was no longer something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. And all it had taken was a rainy night and a flat tire. As John continued to adjust to his new life, he found himself thinking about the people who had helped shape him, particularly Mr. Freeman. The old man had been there for him when no one else had, offering quiet guidance when John's own life seemed like it was falling apart. Their conversations had always been simple, yet filled with wisdom that John had often overlooked in his younger years. One afternoon, John found himself sitting in Mr. Freeman's living room, the two of them sharing a pot of coffee. The familiar setting, the warmth of the room, and the soft hum of Mr. Freeman's old record player made John feel grounded. It was here, in these moments of peace, that John reflected on just how much his life had changed. "You've done well, John," Mr. Freeman said, looking up from his cup. His voice, though gentle, carried the weight of years of experience. "You've come a long way." John chuckled, shaking his head. I don't know if I'd call it doing well. Just getting by, I guess. You've always been good at getting by, Mr. Freeman replied, his eyes twinkling with understanding. But now, you're doing more than that. You're living again. You're not just surviving, you're thriving. John thought about those words. For so many years, he had lived in a state of quiet survival, never allowing himself to fully embrace life. His past mistakes, the loneliness, and the constant fear of disappointment had held him back. But now, everything felt different. The job at Golden Leaf, the people who cared about him, his world had shifted in ways he couldn't quite explain. I never thought I'd get here, John said, his voice quieter now. I mean, I just helped a woman with a flat tire. I didn't expect all of this. Mr. Freeman smiled, leaning forward. That's the thing about kindness, John. It's never just about the immediate result. You never know where it'll lead or how it'll come back to you. You were kind because it was the right thing to do, not because you wanted anything in return. And that's what makes it powerful. John nodded, feeling the truth of Mr. Freeman's words resonate deeply within him. He had spent so many years questioning his worth, believing that his life was small and insignificant. But now, he saw that even the smallest actions, like stopping to help a stranger, had the potential to set off a chain reaction that could lead to something greater. You've always been the one to show me that, haven't you? John said, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You never asked for anything. You just gave. Mr. Freeman shrugged, his eyes softening. I gave because I saw you needed it, and because it was the right thing to do. There's no glory in it. But in the end, you learn that helping others isn't about what you get in return. It's about making the world a little better. John thought back to the morning Gerald had arrived at his house, offering him the check and the opportunity for a new life. That moment had been the turning point, the moment when everything John had known about his life was turned upside down. He had hesitated at first, unsure of whether he deserved such kindness. But now, as he sat with Mr. Freeman, he understood. It wasn't about deserving it. It was about being open to receiving the goodness that came into his life, even when it was unexpected. The people who had shown him kindness had done so not because he was perfect, but because they saw something in him that he hadn't yet seen in himself. As their conversation drifted to other matters, John realized how far he had come. He no longer saw himself as the man he used to be, the lonely, distrustful man who kept to himself. Now, he was someone who had learned to give and to receive, to trust and to let go. And most importantly, he had learned to believe that he deserved the good things that were happening in his life. It wasn't an easy lesson, but it was one that had changed everything for John. And as he left Mr. Freeman's house that afternoon, he walked with a newfound sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, John felt ready to face whatever came next. He wasn't alone anymore. The kindness he had put into the world had come back to him, and it had transformed his life in ways he never could have imagined. It wasn't just about the job, the money, or the opportunities. It was about the way those acts of kindness had shaped who he had become. And in that moment, John realized that he wasn't just surviving. He was living. And that was enough. As John's life slowly found a new rhythm, he became more attuned to the changes that had begun unfolding around him. His work at Golden Leaf kept him busy, and for the first time in years, he was fully engaged in something he was proud of. The work was challenging, and he found himself learning new skills every day. But it wasn't just about the job, it was about the environment. He was surrounded by people who valued his input, who recognized his experience, and most importantly, who treated him as an equal. It was a far cry from the life he had lived before, where he felt like he was just getting by, hoping no one noticed his isolation. Now, John was stepping into a world that was open to him, a world where kindness and effort were rewarded with opportunity. However, the change didn't come all at once. It came in small moments, in conversations with colleagues who asked about his day, in the way his boss noticed his work ethic and began assigning him more responsibilities. It came when Sarah, the woman he had helped that rainy night, reached out to him a few weeks after he had accepted the job offer. One evening, as John was getting ready to leave the office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Hi John, I hope everything's going well. I just wanted to let you know that I'm back in town, and I would love to meet up and thank you properly. No more envelopes, I promise." John smiled as he read the message, his heart warming at the thought of seeing Sarah again. Despite everything that had happened, he had never expected to stay in touch with her. But she had meant what she said about staying connected. And now, months later, he could see that she was just as genuine as the day they first met. They set a date for the meeting, and when the day arrived, John found himself feeling nervous, something he hadn't expected. The same feelings of self-doubt crept up, reminding him of his old life when he had convinced himself that he wasn't deserving of kindness or attention. But now, as he walked into the small cafe where they agreed to meet, John reminded himself that this was different. He had earned this. When Sarah walked in, she greeted him with a warm smile, and John could see the gratitude in her eyes. They exchanged pleasantries, and after a few minutes, Sarah leaned forward and spoke with sincerity. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about you lately, John," she began. "The way you helped me that night. It wasn't just the tire you fixed. It was the way you made me feel safe, like I wasn't alone out there. That kind of thing sticks with you, you know?" John nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had never fully understood the impact of that simple act of kindness, but hearing it from Sarah made him realize just how much it had meant to her. "I didn't think it was anything special," John replied softly. "I just did what anyone would do." Sarah smiled gently, shaking her head. "Not everyone would do that, especially late at night, in the rain. You were a stranger, but you didn't treat me like one." The conversation turned light, but John couldn't shake the sense of gratitude that filled him. It wasn't just the meeting with Sarah that had changed him. It was everything that had followed. His life, which once seemed so small and insignificant, had expanded. He had stepped out of his comfort zone, accepted help, and trusted that good things could happen. As they finished their coffee and parted ways, Sarah gave him a warm hug, reminding him that she was only a phone call away if he ever needed anything. And as John walked back to his truck, he realized something he hadn't fully understood until that moment. He was no longer the same person he had been. The world had opened up to him, not because of the job or the money, but because he had chosen to step into the light. He had embraced the kindness he had once pushed away, and in return, life had rewarded him with opportunities he never could have imagined. The story of the tire had been just the beginning of a new chapter. John's transformation wasn't overnight, nor was it complete. But he was on the right path, one that was filled with hope, connection, and the understanding that kindness was a gift, not only to others, but to himself as well. John's journey was one that resonated far beyond his own life. It was a story that could be understood by anyone, regardless of where they were from or what they had experienced. The themes of kindness, transformation, and redemption were universal, something that everyone, at some point, could relate to. Many people find themselves stuck in routines, haunted by past mistakes, and living in isolation, much like John did for so many years. His story was for those who doubted themselves, who believed that their past defined their future, or who thought that their efforts went unnoticed. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness, done without expectation, can lead to extraordinary changes in one's life. John's life wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy. But through his simple act of helping Sarah with her flat tire, he learned that kindness has a ripple effect. Something that might seem insignificant in the moment can lead to profound shifts in life. The kindness he extended to a stranger came back to him in ways he couldn't have predicted, not just in material things like the money or job, but in emotional growth, connections, and the feeling that he wasn't invisible anymore. The universal nature of John's story made it easy for people to relate. It wasn't about the grand gestures, it was about the small, everyday moments that can make a big difference. Whether it's offering someone a helping hand on a rainy night, or simply being there for someone who needs to talk, those actions matter. They don't always come with immediate rewards, but sometimes, over time, they lead to something greater. And for those who watched John's story unfold, those who had their own doubts or were struggling with their own issues, it was a reminder that life doesn't always follow a straight path. There are unexpected twists and turns, and sometimes the most unexpected moments can lead to the most remarkable changes. For John, it was just one rainy night, one flat tire. But for others, his story might be the nudge they needed to believe that kindness, whether it's giving or receiving, has the power to change lives. His story appealed to anyone who had ever doubted their worth, who had ever felt like they didn't belong, or who had ever questioned whether the good they did in the world was truly meaningful. It spoke to those who felt invisible or overlooked, to those who needed a reminder that kindness and vulnerability are strengths, not weaknesses. In a world often focused on individual success and competition, John's story was a testament to the power of human connection. It wasn't about getting ahead or climbing to the top. It was about being part of a community, about understanding that no one is truly alone, and that even the smallest gesture can have a ripple effect that changes everything. As John continued to grow, learning to accept the gifts that life had to offer, his story became not just his own. It became a shared experience, one that anyone could take something from. It was a story of hope, transformation, and the belief that kindness is never wasted, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem at the time. And for the millions of people watching, it was a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful moments in life are the ones that don't happen as expected, like helping a woman with a flat tire on a rainy night, and finding, in return, a life that was better than anything you could have imagined. Where are you watching from? What would you have done in his situation? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more